In 1849, workers digging through the ruins of Nineveh pulled clay tablets from the collapsed library of an Assyrian king. One of those tablets, now resting behind glass at the British Museum in London, contains a passage that has troubled scholars for over a century. It describes the gods themselves in a state of terror, not anger, not judgment, fear. They ascend from the surface of the earth. They press against the outer wall of heaven. They crouch like dogs. Something was coming that even they could not stop, and one god among them had seen it first. His name was Enki. What he did next changed the course of every civilization that remembered him. The tablet belongs to a set of three, known collectively as the Atrahasis epic. The most complete copy was carved in Akkadian cuneiform during the reign of King Ammi-Saduqa of Babylon, roughly 1700 years before the Common Era. A scribe named Nur-Aya pressed these words into wet clay and fired them to last. They did last. More than 37 centuries later, the full text was published in a critical edition by W.G. Lambert of the University of Birmingham and A.R. Millard of the University of Liverpool, released through Oxford University Press in 1969. This is not a fragmentary myth stitched together from scattered pieces. The Atrahasis runs approximately 1,200 lines across 3 tablets. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And buried inside its flood narrative is a structural problem that mainstream Assyriology has described but never fully resolved. Before the catastrophe arrives, the highest god in the Mesopotamian pantheon administers a binding oath of secrecy. Every god present swears to remain silent. One god, Enki, finds a way around the oath, not by breaking it, by exploiting a technicality. If the oath was merely a literary device, no technicality would be required. The legal precision of the workaround implies the legal precision of the constraint, and if Enki alone possessed the foreknowledge to act before the event, the text is telling us something specific about what he knew and when he knew it. So before this story pulls you under, consider subscribing and do not forget to like this video. The Atrahasis opens long before the flood. It opens with labor. The younger gods, called the Igigi, have been assigned the physical work of maintaining the world. They dig canals. They dredge riverbeds. They haul earth under the supervision of the senior gods, the Anunnaki. The text gives a specific duration for this arrangement: 3,600 years. That number corresponds to a Sumerian unit called a sar, a mathematical cycle embedded throughout Mesopotamian cosmology. After that span of time, the Igigi revolt. They burn their tools at night. They surround the dwelling of Enlil, chief executive of the Divine Assembly. This is a labor strike described in cuneiform more than 1,000 years before the earliest Greek texts about divine conflict. The assembly convenes in crisis. Enlil demands to know who leads the rebellion. Enki proposes a solution. Rather than punish the Igigi, create a new being to carry the workload. A birth goddess called Nintu, also known as Mami, fashions humanity from clay mixed with the blood and flesh of a slain god. The text names this god We-Ilu. It describes him as a deity who had intelligence. His essence passes into the clay. Humanity is born as replacement labor for exhausted gods. The species multiplies, grows noisy, disturbs Enlil's rest. He sends plague, famine, drought. Each time, Enki quietly advises humanity on how to survive, which offering to make, which god to petition. Enlil's frustration builds across centuries of failed suppression. Finally, he convenes the assembly one last time and demands total annihilation. A flood that will wipe the surface clean. Lambert reads this entire sequence as a literary theodicy, an ancient attempt to explain why human life is difficult and why the gods appear indifferent to suffering. Stephanie Daly of the Oriental Institute at Oxford places the text within a genre of divine human boundary literature. Jean Bottero of the École pratique des hautes études in Paris treats the flood as a narrative resolution to the overpopulation problem the text constructs for itself. These are serious positions held by serious scholars. They explain what the text does as a story. They account for its narrative architecture and its theological function within Babylonian culture. The recitation of the Atrahasis during sacred festivals confirms its religious and political purpose. These readings have earned their standing in the field, and they deserve to be heard at full strength. But there is a passage inside the flood sequence that these readings describe without fully explaining. When Enlil secures the assembly's agreement to destroy humanity, the text does not simply say the gods decided. It says an oath was administered. Anu, the supreme god, the one who ranks above even Enlil in the divine hierarchy, oversees the binding. Every god present swears. The secrecy is institutional. Thorkild Jacobson of Yale and later Harvard published a landmark study in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies in 1943, arguing that the Mesopotamian Divine Assembly functioned as a form of primitive democracy, a deliberative body with protocols, votes, and binding decisions. If Jacobson is correct, this oath was not symbolic, it was policy, enacted by the highest governing body these civilizations recognized. Consider what that means in practice. Anu was not a middle-ranking administrator. In the Mesopotamian divine hierarchy, Anu occupied the position of sky god and father of the gods. His authority sat above Enlil's executive power and above Enki's domain of wisdom and water. When a decision required Anu's personal administration of the oath, the text was signaling that this was not a local or departmental matter. It was a decree from the top of the institutional structure. The binding force of that oath derived from the highest authority the scribes could conceive, and Enki, present in that assembly, knew exactly what he was bound by. Now watch what Enki does. He does not break the oath. He does not stand before humanity and announce what is coming. Instead, he goes to the home of the flood hero, a man living in the city of Shuruppak, and he speaks to a wall, a reed wall. The text records his words directed not at a person, but at a structure. Wall, hear me. Reed wall, remember all my words. The flood hero overhears. That is the mechanism. Enki technically never spoke to a human being. He spoke to construction material. And through that legal fiction, he delivered the most consequential warning in the entire Mesopotamian literary tradition. This is not the behavior of a trickster god playing games. This is the behavior of someone operating inside a system with enforceable rules who has found the one procedural gap that allows him to act without violating the letter of his oath. If the oath was decorative, a narrative flourish, no gap would be necessary. The gap reveals the constraint, and the constraint reveals the institution. The scribes who carved this into clay were not writing about a clever deity improvising a workaround. They were documenting a legal procedure followed with precision under conditions of extreme time pressure. The reed wall speech is not a poetic flourish. It is a recorded method. The method implies the rule it was designed to satisfy. But Enki does not stop at warning. He provides specifications. The text describes exact construction parameters for the survival vessel. Dimensions. Sealing methods using bitumen. Loading protocols for animals and grain. A departure timeline. This is not a vague divine whisper to seek high ground. This is an operational evacuation plan delivered by someone who has calculated the scope of what is coming and modeled the margin of survival. Lambert's own translation of the pre-flood sequence shows that the Anunnaki gods themselves ascend before the waters arrive. They do not shelter on Earth, they go up. And when the flood reaches its peak, they are described sitting in thirst and hunger, crouching, weeping. These are not the words of omnipotent beings executing their own judgment. These are the words of beings who fled a surface they could no longer occupy. The question presses itself forward. If the gods ordered the flood, why did they evacuate from it? If they controlled the event, why were they afraid? And if Enki alone had the foresight to prepare a survival protocol with engineering-level specificity, what had he calculated that the others had not? The mainstream scholarly community has not published a formal answer to this structural question. No article in the Journal of Cuneiform Studies, the Journal of Near Eastern Studies, or the Zeitschrift für Assyriology has tested whether the ascent language in the Atrahasis describes metaphorical withdrawal or physical departure from a surface location. The question has not been refuted. It has not been engaged. It occupies a category that does not appear in the academic literature at all. Michael Heiser held a doctorate in Hebrew Bible and Semitic languages from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He published the most technically rigorous critiques of Zecharia Sitchin's alternative translations, and several of those critiques land with real force. Heiser demonstrated that specific Sumerian terms Sitchin relied on do not carry the meanings Sitchin assigned them. These are legitimate challenges at the lexical level. But Heiser's work focuses on vocabulary, on whether individual words were translated correctly. He does not address the structural architecture of the Atrahasis itself, the oath, the workaround, the engineering specifications, the physical ascent, the divine fear. These are not translation questions, they are narrative logic questions, and they remain without a published institutional response. Sitchin, working outside the Academy from 1976 onward, argued in The 12th Planet that Enki's foreknowledge was astronomical, that he had calculated the orbital return of a celestial body and understood the gravitational consequences for the planet's surface. Sitchin's framework has sold millions of copies in dozens of languages. It has been dismissed categorically by Assyriology. But categorical dismissal and formal refutation are not the same thing. The channel documents this distinction not as evidence that the alternative framework is correct, but as a factual observation about how the institutional response has been structured. Now return to the ground. Shuruppak, the city the Atrahasis names as the home of the flood hero. Today it is called Tel Farah. It sits in the flat alluvial plain of southern Iraq. In 1931, the University of Pennsylvania sent an expedition directed by Eric Schmidt. They found a distinct flood deposit, a layer of water-laid sediment dated to approximately 2900 BCE. Below it, the remains of a thriving settlement. Above it, evidence of disruption and rebuilding. In 1929, Leonard Woolley excavated at Ur, roughly 100 kilometers to the southeast. He found a similar deposit, a thick layer of clean clay separating two phases of occupation. Stephen Langdon and L.C. Wortlin found another at Kish, further north. The dates do not align precisely. These were not the same flood event, but the pattern is consistent across the southern Mesopotamian plain. Multiple sites show evidence of catastrophic inundation within the same broad period the texts describe. Then there is Eridu, Tel Abu Shahrain, Enki's own city, excavated by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd for the Iraqi Directorate of Antiquities between 1946 and 1949. They uncovered 18 successive temple levels built one on top of the other on the same sacred spot. The earliest level dates to approximately 5400 BCE. That makes it one of the oldest permanent religious structures anywhere in Mesopotamia. For more than 2,000 years, the people of Eridu built, rebuilt, and rebuilt again on this single location. The devotion is architectural. You can see it in the stratigraphy. Layer after layer of mud brick walls rising from the same foundation. Each new temple was not simply built beside the old one. It was built on top of it. The previous structure was carefully filled with sand and rubble, leveled, and used as the platform for the next iteration. This was not replacement. It was preservation through accumulation. The priests and builders of Eridu did not abandon the sacred spot when it wore down. They buried it and built higher. The act repeated itself across 2 millennia. Whatever Eridu represented to the people who maintained it, that meaning was worth rebuilding 18 times on the same square of ground. And then, it stopped. Eridu was abandoned. The temples fell silent. The city that the Sumerians themselves called the First City, the place where kingship descended from heaven according to the king list, was left to the desert. The Era epic, a later Akkadian text, tells a parallel story from the opposite direction. In this narrative, Marduk leaves Babylon. He vacates his station. And the moment he departs, cosmic disorder floods in. Plague, violence, civilizational collapse. The text explicitly links the departure of a god from his earthly seat to the destruction that follows. The Atrahasis and the Era epic are mirror images. In the Atrahasis, the gods leave before the catastrophe. In the Era epic, the leaving causes the catastrophe. Both texts treat divine physical presence on the surface as structurally necessary for civilization to hold. This pattern does not stay inside Mesopotamia. The Book of Enoch, specifically the section called the Book of Watchers, found in chapters 6 through 16 of 1st Enoch, describes a group of beings called the Watchers who descend to Mount Hermon. They transfer knowledge to humanity: metallurgy, astronomy, herbalism, the arts of war. They are warned of coming judgment. Specific humans are given survival instructions. The Watchers themselves are bound and removed. The structural skeleton is the same. Beings with foreknowledge, a transfer of technical information, specific warnings delivered to chosen individuals. Then, withdrawal before catastrophe. What separates this tradition from the Atrahasis is geography and language. What connects them is the sequence. That sequence does not vary. The Matsya Purana of the Hindu Vedic tradition describes the god Vishnu appearing to a man named Manu in the form of a fish. He warns Manu that a flood will destroy all life. He provides exact instructions for building a vessel. He specifies what must be preserved: seeds, sages, the knowledge necessary to rebuild. The deity himself guides the vessel through the waters. Foreknowledge, technical specifications, departure from the pre-flood world, the same 3-part architecture. The Matsya Purana was compiled in Sanskrit, thousands of kilometers from southern Mesopotamia, drawing on oral traditions that predate the written text by an unknown span of centuries. The specificity of the instructions in the Vedic version rivals that of the Atrahasis. Both texts are concerned not just with survival, but with what survives. The selection is deliberate. The knowledge transfer is intentional. The Popol Vuh of the Quiché Maya records the gods destroying a previous creation by flood when the created beings fail in their purpose. Before the destruction arrives, the creators withdraw. They do not remain on the surface to witness what they have sanctioned. They leave first. The survivors of the previous world are diminished and transformed. The Dogon people of Mali in West Africa preserve oral traditions documented by the French anthropologists Marcel Griaule and Germaine Dieterlen, published in 1965. Their tradition describes beings called the Nomo, amphibious instructors who arrive from elsewhere, establish civilizational knowledge, and depart. The departure is framed not as abandonment, but as scheduled withdrawal, a leaving that was always part of the plan. Mesopotamia, the Levant, South Asia, Mesoamerica, West Africa. 5 traditions across 5 continents. No demonstrated chain of transmission connects all 5. the convergence stands without a consensus explanation in the academic literature. The counter-arguments deserve their full weight. Flood stories appear in virtually every civilization that developed along major river systems. Annual flooding in southern Mesopotamia would generate deep cultural memory of catastrophic inundation. The deposits at Ur, Kish, and Shuruppak may represent real regional events, exaggerated through centuries of oral retelling into a universal deluge. This is the position held by most environmental archaeologists, and it carries substantial explanatory power. Jacobson's primitive democracy thesis cuts in both directions. If the divine assembly mirrors human governance, the oath of secrecy could be literary projection. Human institutional behavior mapped onto the gods, not evidence of a real governing body among non-human beings. Heiser's lexical corrections are real. The word Shem does not mean rocket in any attested Sumerian usage. The etymology Sitchin proposed for Nephilim does not hold under standard philological analysis. These are genuine weaknesses in the alternative framework, and they compromise specific load-bearing claims. Joseph Campbell's monomyth framework proposes that universal psychological archetypes generate parallel narratives across unconnected cultures. People facing similar threats produce similar stories. Independent invention is a documented phenomenon. This model has real scope and real scholarly support. The tablets do not resolve this tension. They hold it. The Atrahasis describes a binding institutional oath of secrecy, administered by the highest divine authority. It describes one god who circumvented that oath through a legal technicality because he possessed foreknowledge, the others either lacked or suppressed. It describes that God delivering an engineering-level evacuation protocol to a human in a specific named city. It describes the gods themselves ascending from the surface before the catastrophe arrived and cowering in fear when the event exceeded what they had anticipated. The archaeological sites named in these texts are real. Shuruppak has a flood layer. Ur has a flood layer. Eridu, the city of the god who knew first, was built and rebuilt 18 times on sacred ground and then abandoned to silence. 5 separate civilizations on 5 separate continents preserved narratives with the same structural architecture. Foreknowledge, warning, departure, catastrophe. No published model accounts for all 5. The Sumerian king list, inscribed on the Weld Blundell prism, now held at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, records the names of kings who ruled before the flood and kings who ruled after. The boundary between the two eras is marked with a single phrase: the flood swept over. Everything before that line is treated as a different kind of time, a different kind of world. The antediluvian kings ruled for spans of tens of thousands of years. The post-diluvian kings ruled for decades. The transition is not presented as mythological exaggeration. The scribes treated it as a factual administrative boundary. Before and after. 2 worlds separated by an event the texts could name, but not fully explain. The clay tablets that Nur-Aya pressed and fired in Babylon 37 centuries ago are still in their cases at the British Museum. The cuneiform is legible. The translations are published. The structural questions they raise have been catalogued but not closed. What the ancient scribes recorded when they described Enki's calculation, the Anunnaki's ascent, and the silence of the gods who swore the oath, that remains an open file. The tablets have delivered their testimony. What we do with it is the question they left for us.